Commercial drones are everywhere nowadays. Product deliveries, sporting events, forest fire monitoring, agriculture, and nighttime displays are just some of the uses for these vehicles. But increasingly, off-the-shelf drones are being equipped with makeshift weaponry, allowing them to become destructive.
These things are easily weaponized with things like a grenade or a Molotov cocktail, not designed specifically for this purpose.
Paul Lushenko is a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army and a PhD student in international relations at Cornell University in New York. He's studying the impacts of drone warfare and how that's spilling over into the commercial market.
So there's a certain deterrence by way of just national regulation that I think has been effective, but yet we know that doesn't stop the most determined of criminals.
He says we need to be aware of unmanned aerial vehicles now more than ever.
You'd have to communicate that you actually have a drone capability, because again, we're uber sensitive as a global public to this capability for all the right reasons.
We'll also discuss important steps to follow should you deploy drones for business operations and how to incorporate threats from above into your security plans. Hello there, I'm Tristan Field-Jones, and welcome to another edition of SitRep. Paul Lushenko joins us now, and Paul, you have a lengthy title thanks to extensive expertise in your field. So let's just start off by introducing yourself, and again, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, first and foremost, Tristan, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Glad to have the ability to communicate sort of the body of my research at Cornell University on drone warfare, but also shedding light on sort of experiences the last several decades in managing the intelligence surrounding these operations in the clear theaters of war for the United States. So in short, I spent about 20 years in the military, really cutting my teeth in leading some incredible analysts who collect, analyze, and then disseminate information in support of special operations forces, and mostly in support of raids and lethal strikes. Currently, I'm at Cornell University pursuing a PhD in international relations with a special focus on the evolving character of war, which is to say the advent of remote warfare technologies and especially the drone. And in addition to that, I'm a senior fellow at the Tech Policy Institute at Cornell University, which deals with the intersection, as it were, between technology and politics in one of three different ways: for remote warfare technologies, for democracies, but also for public health issues such as vaccine hesitancy related to COVID. So again, I'm really happy to be here and share some thoughts with you.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And there's so much to dig into for sure. Paul, my first question for you is tell us a little bit more about your experience with drones and the research you've done on those vehicles.
Yeah. So I went to the United States Military Academy at West Point. And for those in your audience who don't know what that is, that's the Army sort of military academy in New York, as opposed to the Naval Academy in Maryland, which is designed to build leaders of character that serve in the United States Army, but then also serve as leaders in their communities within the country and even globally over the lifetime of service. And so I was commissioned in 2005 in what was called then the class of 9/11, because at that point, the Twin Towers were struck when I was a freshman, actually, at West Point. And then I commissioned, after a couple, 4 years there, I guess, with a Bachelor of Science as an intelligence officer for the Army. And at that point, drones were really not a thing. You fast forward about a couple of years after my last deployment in 2016, I was really interested on bridging this gap between the military and academia to shed more light on, one, what the heck drone warfare is to begin with, because it's really not clear to me how this concept is defined. And then two, study more rigorously the implications for a couple of things. One is emerging patterns of drone strikes globally. The modal sort of U.S. strike against a terrorist in Pakistan no longer defines this enterprise globally. And the second implication from that is how the public perceives not just support or approval for these operations, but also legitimacy, which is very challenging to study for a lot of methodological reasons. So at Cornell, I'm positioned well with my doctoral supervisor, Her name is Professor Sarah Krebs, one of the world's foremost experts on drone warfare, to really dig very much deeper into these questions that have real policy implications. So, civilian casualties, for instance, and how we ameliorate those in conflict. So, I would tell you real quick in closing here, the body of my research is really bounded by a couple, I think, key research sort of questions. One is, what are the implications of drone warfare for global order? What I propose, my colleagues and I, that is really advancing the scholarship away from these questions about effectiveness tactically, about proliferation, and not even just the legal, moral, ethical implications, but the global implications for what we call global order, how states actually interact with each other. So that's kind of one key question. The other question, too, is how we understand emerging patterns of drone warfare, because again, it's not reducible to the US strikes anymore only. And then finally, are the implications of these patterns on public perceptions of especially legitimacy. So hopefully we'll have time to talk through some of that stuff today.
Yeah, well, and again, we mentioned this at the very outset. There's a lot of ground to cover here. I think let's start with the basics. And again, for the security professionals listening to this, we will explain very much so why drones need to be considered perhaps an increasing threat or an increasing concern, at least, even if you're in, again, a Western nation or a stable country, because their use has really skyrocketed over the last several years, I guess, pun intended. But anyway, let's do a quick definition because like drone warfare really isn't new when you think about it, but a relatively recent development is the availability of commercial drones.
Yes.
And let's just quickly talk about the differences between the two. So again, when I think of a military drone, I think of the Predator drones that the U.S. uses. And of course, there's many other countries who have them. The recent fighting in Ukraine, for instance, we've seen some of the drones that they've been supplied with, which have been used to devastating effect in many cases. But why don't we do a quick definition between what a commercial drone is versus what a military drone is?
Yeah, it's a good baseline. And again, I sort of assume this with my research. So I'm glad that we're starting here to better connect with folks who may not like look at this on a daily basis. So the best way to view this is really kind of the extreme spectrum of drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, which is to say platforms that fly with a operator that is disassociated from the actual cockpit. I mean, these are unmanned capabilities. Statement of the obvious, but important to understand when we say UAVs or UAS, unmanned aerial vehicle, unmanned aerial system. We're talking about a family or suite of systems that are not necessarily invested with the pilot. So that's kind of first point. Second point is the two extremes here. On the one hand, you have these very large armed and networked drones that are akin to what you term the sort of General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper or the MQ-1 Predator. These are very capable platforms that fly very high, very fast, relatively fast, related to the smaller drones, carry a heavy payload, which is to say weapons, and have a long loitering time, which is very appealing for political officials and military leaders that are attempting to execute precise strikes that balance risk to force, but also risk to civilians. So that's kind of the large body there. Then you have within that military subset sort of medium-sized drones. I think it's important, although you didn't ask this question, to tear that out separately because that's getting a lot of playtime internationally based upon what's happening in Ukraine. But the sort of leading example here would be the Bayraktar TB2 that's manufactured by Turkey. It's a medium-sized drone, which means it's not as capable in terms of loitering time, operational reach, payload, or altitude as the MQ-1 or MQ-9, but nevertheless can be devastating because it provides the ability to vertically envelop from the air an adversary, who, by the way, we've seen even among sort of contemporary modern militaries are having difficult time defeating or countering these capabilities. So that's the military sort of side of this. When you transition to the commercial side, these are really smaller, cheaper, commercially available, commercial off the shelf capabilities like the Chinese manufactured DJI, also been employed by Ukrainian citizens and partisans to devastating effect against Russian forces as well. These things are easily weaponized with things like a grenade or a Molotov cocktail, not designed specifically for this purpose, but retrofitted nevertheless very easily to be employed in this respect. Within this family of commercial or hobby drones, there's a variety of intended purposes. One is just leisure recreation. My kid, for instance, has a very small drone that is not as capable as a DJI and really annoys me, flying around the house. Nevertheless, you also have sort of commercial capability for crop dusting. I'm from Oregon, worked on a cherry farm when I grew up, and as I was leaving to go to West Point, there were conversations about the sort of capability on the horizon to buy down the time, the money that farmers would take, right, would have to expend to do sort of crop dusting. And so there are a variety of sort of implications there as well. And so I think those two spectrums, sort of the military large and medium, designed specifically for striking not just enemy personnel target killing, but also key materiel like a capability, a weapon system, and then the commercial small, available, cheaper, easily weaponized as well. It's a good way to think about drones. The thing about drones is very appealing is it provides an asymmetry of capability for a small non-modern military like the Ukrainian forces. This is quite appealing, but also for a non-state actor like the Islamic State. They've come to use drones in a way that represents a number one threat for at least U.S. service members in the region, which is the Middle East. And this is articulated by the former CENTCOM or Central Command commander, four-star Marine general. And so these things are really devastating because they are so fungible.
How easy is it for, let's say, an extremist group, and we use the Islamic State as an example, but again, they're located all over the world, but how easy is it for one of those groups to get a hold of a drone and arm it?
I mean, I would say extremely easy. It doesn't take an expert like myself to tell you or anybody else how easy this is. Now, the cost per outfitting of a commercially available cheaper drone with a weapon is a different matter. But I mean, I would say the ballpark figure is probably a spectrum from anywhere from a couple $100 based upon the size of the drone to several $1,000s, which makes them very appealing because again, they can sort of circumvent the longer acquisition timeline and significant ceiling cost that would otherwise be in place to build these large, capable drones. I'll tell you that it was surprising for me, although I spent 4 years in Afghanistan over the lifetime of my service, thereabouts, to learn when I redeployed and when America withdrew that the Taliban had built an unmanned aerial system, secret, unit, whatever they wanted to call it. I guess I should have anticipated it, but I did not see it when I was there. And so, what we're seeing is adversaries across the world. I think it's something like 65 stateless groups, based upon analysis from one of our senior non-resident fellows at the Tech Policy Lab, James Rogers at Southern Denmark University, doing some interesting research. He's identified about 65 stateless actors that have these drones, in addition to well over 100 countries that have these capabilities. And so I think it's relatively simple for one of these stateless actors to get this drone and deploy it.
And how exactly do they end up arming these drones? I mean, obviously, we don't want to give people a how-to manual on how to do this at home, but is it just a matter of strapping a bomb and flying it into a sensitive region? How do they actually go about this?
Essentially, that's exactly what's happening. So you would have recalled, likely, given your interest in current affairs, that when Russia was storming towards Kiev, citizens within that country, that city, were banding together to build these Molotov cocktails, which were then retrofitted on a capability, the DJI at this point, that super smart people within Ukraine had figured out how to weaponize. So I don't know the each is that there in terms of the actual hardware, software additions that would make this a capable drone. But what I do know is that there's resident capability within our communities to make this happen. So that's kind of one aspect. But the longer term endurance and sustainabilities of these operations with like a partisan's force is likely the more significant question, because what we call the tooth to tail, or the supply chain network that undergirds these operations, in some cases is decisive. It is the Achilles heel for the use of these commercially available drones. Of course, in a region like the Middle East or Central Asia with an ongoing war, both declared and undeclared, this would be very challenging. We know from documents gathered from the raid against Osama bin Laden by SEAL Team 6 that U.S. drones, by virtue of just flying above, had a really disruptive sort of impact on the way that these sort of terrorists maneuvered, which means that it was hard for them to get the stock of supplies. What's happening in Ukraine right now, as it relates to commercially available off-the-shelf capabilities, is relying on networks of suppliers and donors in Western Europe and beyond the sort of continental borders of Europe, America, and elsewhere to supply parts, material that would go into ammunition, and then ferry that into the western side of Ukraine on the border with Poland. And so what you're seeing is a professionalization, really, of a small sort of drone fleet that is easy to get into, but potentially harder to sustain. And that crossover point is really interesting as we start to derive research questions about the shifting character of war. In other words, what's it actually take for a band of insurgents or partisan fighters to have a sustainable capability, which is not military, but nevertheless professionalized? And so I think that's really fascinating to think about.
I think, Paul, it's also worth noting that, when, for instance, Russia uses cruise missiles in Ukraine, or when the U.S. does that for aerial strikes, each one of those missiles costs millions upon millions of dollars. And when you compare that to even an expensive drone, there's just no difference. And yet, as you mentioned, we've seen how devastating these drones can be for a fraction of the price, and a fraction of the experience, and a fraction of the resources.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. I will tell you, however, that countries beyond the United States, one, are interested. So let's kind of step away from the sort of partisan insurgent use of these. Countries are really interested in these capabilities because they do provide asymmetry, even at a state-to-state level. Because the reality, the sad reality of it is, Tristan, that countermeasures are virtually incapable of defeating these platforms as it stands right now. And again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. Take a look at what happened in Armenia and Azerbaijan in the sort of contested Nagorno-Karabakh region, where the capability development is outpacing the countermeasures. And that's very appealing to countries. And Turkey, by the way, has expanded its drone sales prolifically in the last several years, to the point where President Erdogan of the Turkish sort of democracy will tell us that Turkish drones in particular are changing the rules of war.
That is kind of the crux of this conversation in terms of why it matters and why that should be part of your security plan, because eventually these things are going to make their way. I mean, they are making their way around the world. So, Paul, let's talk about, why are these drones so difficult to defeat?
Well, a lot of this comes down to the science behind radar systems. I'm not an expert on this, but when you talk about identification, location, tracking, targeting, typically the systems, most of which were built decades ago for a different threat environment. So that's actually the intent or capability of an adversary, coupled with the operating environment, the region, the weather, the climatology, were rated against large militaries that have capabilities, some early generation stealth, some much less capable, with large cross sections that makes them more of a magnet, as it were, to radars. And so our systems are just not optimized to identify, collect against, and then therefore defeat and even jam, especially these smaller drones. They often fly within an envelope from the ground terrain to a certain ceiling that is just not covered by our large sort of what we call air defense artillery or integrated air defense system. And so that's a kind of a principal reason that this is taking place. And even when soldiers are outfitted with capability, this capability is more experimental at this point. Soldiers sort of fire waves off of some sort of weapon system. I mean, a lot of this stuff takes a lot more testing, and then it's compounded by or exacerbated by, at least in an American and Western military context, the sort of elongated and frustrated acquisitions process, because the amount of stakeholders that are involved and not just identifying a capability, which is clearly needed, but then programmatically building the capability within budget thresholds and then having it tested.
One of the questions that a lot of people might be wondering is how much of a threat are drones in places like, again, the U.S. and Canada, or because I might be able to understand Western Europe or Europe overall, since they are still regions of that are quite close to North Africa and quite close to the Middle East and more of these volatile areas. So I could for sure see why drones would maybe be an increasing concern there. would we in North America ever have to be worried about, drone strikes from whoever taking place in our borders?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'd like to say no by way of our public servants, law enforcement, National Guard, Border Patrol, whatever it may be, simply because we're in democratic political regimes in Canada and the United States that have congressional or parliamentary oversight on the employment of these systems within our borders, which again is to say that law enforcement officials, based upon regulations and protocols codified in local, state, provincial, national statutes, can't necessarily use these capabilities at their own whim. And when they do, and if it's justified in extremis, which means in an extreme case, let's say like the rioting that took place in Portland, Oregon, this last couple of summers, it stands to reason there's a lot of questions and a lot of blowback that therefore compels these officials to justify ex post facto why they use it in the first place and potentially without explicit authorization. So as it stands right now, I think the militarization of law enforcement really hasn't weaponized, to use that word loosely, drones in the same way within our borders here in North America as they've been, of course, overseas. And that's not to say it won't happen. And additionally, I also think that we have to be a little bit realistic about the capability, right? I mean, this stuff creates a lot of angst, especially for anti-drone advocates who actually think we have fully autonomous weapon systems and drones. I mean, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we actually don't. These capabilities may be able to fly on a pre-programmed route, but they certainly don't engage a target on their own accord, nor do I think for a lot of moral, ethical, and legal reasons would at least the U.S. military want that to take place. I mean, a commander's always in the loop, as we say. Nevertheless, as I said earlier, drones can watch and they can aid. And it is this persistent loitering capability that gives a lot of comfort to especially political officials who are subject to what we call audience costs at the ballot box to make decisions with the most information at hand. And by the way, we should provide them this capability. So the use of a drone, let's say an MQ-9 Reaper on the border between the United States and Mexico, may not be that bad of a thing as it relates to collecting intelligence, let's say on immigration, illegal immigration, whatever it may be. The optic of doing so, however, is probably the bigger concern, and maybe the laws, rules, and regulations haven't caught up to actually entertain or justify that employment in the first case. And so right now, one, I don't think it's likely we'll see this within our borders in the next several years. Two, if there is a conversation, it's probably healthy, but needs to be managed appropriately, which means all of us, for not just military reasons, but also practical sort of citizenship reasons, ought to be aware of these capabilities. And then three is exercise our ability to vote and to manage policy by way of the ballot box and emphasizing sort of our public officials. And so I think this is a good conversation to scope not just a future capability employment within our borders, but also how we get opportunities to kind of pull the lever one way or another.
So we may not have to worry about, the American government or the Canadian government or, the French government or the German government, whatever. We may not have to worry about them using drones within their borders. But what's preventing one of these extremist groups from acquiring a drone, and if they want to do a lot of damage or use it as a bomb or whatever it may be, what's preventing them from doing that? Or is it just a matter of time before something like that happens?
I personally think it's probably a matter of time before something like that happens. I hate to be sort of soothsayer for negative outcome, but there are initial indications, sort of measures and warnings, as we say in the military, that this is an emerging and likely trend over time. So the use of hobby drones to gain sort of observation over the White House took place recently. You and I have also corresponded about the recent flying of a drone across the North American Canadian border that was stockpiled with like weapons and drugs. We've also know that drug cartels within Latin America and Mexico will use sort of submersible or submarine variants of unmanned systems to transport drugs. And so all of this sort of leads me to believe that it's sooner rather than later that we would see sort of domestic groups either aligned with foreign terrorist or political ideologies within a country sort of weaponize their capability. As it stands for the United States, there are a variety of overlapping local, state, federal requirements that have tamped down the ability for even the hobbyist or the enthusiast for drones to use it to the extent they would like. And this has been challenging, I would imagine, as well for commercial industries, such as Amazon, to try to sort of get into this space. So what that looks like is you can only fly so high. Your platform's got to meet certain standards, and so there's a certain deterrence by way of just national regulation, state and local regulation that I think has been effective. But yet we know that doesn't stop the most determined of criminals and terrorists in a domestic context. And so I think it's a matter of time. The bigger question for me is how you like build resiliency within your community. And so I've not seen this talked about, but let's say it comes to pass and in the future we see domestic groups weaponizing capabilities. It's not inconceivable that you would have drone retailers that would have to manage, like they do gun sales in the United States, a certain background check, registration, sort of a cooling off period between when you buy the capability, when you get the capability, a card that had the drone registered to you that you would carry in your vehicle. So in the event you were stopped and there were questions, whatever it may be. And so if it does come to a point, an inflection point where these systems really are wreaking havoc, that's one way I think to manage that fallout. The other thing too is just to make sure that your community, much like we do with cyber and terrorism in generally, is just aware of indicators of threat. I mean, we have security states around the world that do this very well. Israel comes to mind, but there are other states like Abu Dhabi right now is on the brunt end of strikes from the Houthis that are originating in Yemen. And so what happens there is a culture of resiliency that people are cued into things that just don't look right. Why in my neighborhood in Ithaca, New York, on a sunny 70-degree day, do I see drones flying around when they should not be going to City Hall sort of stuff? And so those are sort of indicators that we can start to kind of train ourselves informally about if it comes to a place where we need to.
You talk about people being aware. Essentially, we're discussing awareness. So if you're a corporate security professional or you're at a large institution, maybe a university or a government agency, whatever it may be, how can you start building that awareness of drones? What are some concrete actions that you can do?
Yeah, so I think probably there's multiple steps here throughout the employment of a drone system, right? So the first is to prepare, I guess, to build resiliency awareness. The first is to engage in conversations like we're having right now. I mean, I don't know how many people this is going to connect with. If it connects with 10, I think we've got a win there, even one, because people are going to be more aware of this conversation. But it's not just podcasts, although these are acceptable for or accessible rather for especially non-expert, casual sort of observers of drones. But there's books, there's articles, there's commentary on the phenomenon of drones, drone warfare, commercial implications, whatever it may be. The other thing too is, especially for those in corporate or industry, is to take a look at like your supply chains. And so this becomes very, I think, self-evident in an ongoing conflict like in Ukraine, in Russia, in which case we saw very visibly, and for all the psychological reasons that you would appreciate, the use of TB2, but also DJIs easily weaponized by citizens to devastating effect against the Russians. And there's an entire supply chain, like I said, that contextualizes this employment to the point where DJI, I think you probably read, has now pulled the plug on selling their systems to Ukraine. I mean, this is crazy. We actually have a multinational corporation which is now moderating the effectiveness of a military force, which is by all accounts should have been outcompeted by the Russians, right? So supply chain management is really key here. For people in industry and corporate worlds who are traveling abroad a lot, because we're so interconnected, interdependent, and integrated anymore, they ought to be aware of sort of issues and incidents that are taking place in areas where they may not think drone strikes would take place. So take a look at what's happening in Abu Dhabi. I mean, this is an epicenter for global commerce, and now is on the receiving end of strikes from the Houthis. I think some of which have disrupted like Formula One races. So I think that in addition to understanding generally what's happening in this drone space, take a look at where you're going on your sales trip or whatever it may be, and just be aware of the threat environment. That's just good practice. I mean, as a father, I constantly take a look at a couple of things when I travel: the weather, right? Transportation, crime rate. And so I think this is probably a good practice that those in industry and business can adopt as well.
Obviously, I think, not everyone's going to necessarily be the target of drones. But having said that, what should you do to try and incorporate this into those plans that you share with employees and colleagues? If you do happen to work in a high target area, or if you're worried about maybe your shop being robbed, or your organization being broken into.
Yeah, so this again won't be rocket science, but it's just good, kind of good to talk about. One thing is to simply recognize the threat as it exists. I mean, we're projecting right now the worst case scenario. It may not be this case all the time in every place. And so if there is a concern that the threat of commercially available, off the shelf, easily weaponized drones can impinge on your safety, then you got to recognize that. Now, from that, so admitting you have a problem, right? What you would do is then just build a plan. Build a plan to defend yourselves, to defend your employees. And I can't really speak to what the specifics will look like, but nevertheless, you need to have a plan. And from there, you then would cycle off what we call SOPs, or standard operating procedures. That in the event of a drone used in X location at our compound, we're going to do this. In the event of a drone used at the front gate, we're going to do this. Okay. So you have the plan, you have these standard operating procedures, and then very importantly and crucially, you actually have to practice the plan. And so this notion of rehearsals becomes very important to, one, determine if the plan is right sized in such a way that makes sense. Two, to kind of iron kinks out over time as you have personnel and employees that will come and go. You may also have structural changes to your business footprint, whatever it may be. And then three, you can update your plan through rehearsals and testing based upon emerging capabilities from said threat, right? And so generally speaking, figure out if you have a problem. Two, come up with a plan, codify this in some sort of SOP or standard operating procedures, and then test it. And test it quarterly, semi-annually, to kind of backstop a lot of changes in the environment within and then without your business.
If you're a corporate security professional listening to this, let's say you oversee a mall or a large commercial property, whatever it may be, and you're thinking of getting a drone, maybe for surveillance, or maybe to monitor parking, or who knows what would be some advice to those folks who might be interested in using drones to help bolster their own security?
Yeah, again, I think just commonsensically, you'd have to communicate to not simply your employee force, but also the broader local community and inference that you actually have a drone capability. Because again, we're uber sensitive as a global public to this capability for all the right reasons, but nevertheless, an deployment of a drone doesn't have to be bad all the time in every place. And so you want to communicate first and foremost, you have this capability, not just to your employees, but also to the local community. Okay. The other thing too is I think that beyond just that, being very transparent about the intent and purpose of the capability in a footprint of an organization, a business with a parking lot, whatever. Maybe there's a sign that says drones are used here. You are privy to surveillance 24/7. Drones will be exclusively used to police this property, observe this property in the hours of, I don't know, 7 at night to 3 in the morning, or it could correspond with your local parks and recreational sort of policy, right? When people would have to leave the parks at night to kind of deter against drug dealing or whatever. So you probably want to communicate in a very overt way. And this is important for all the cultural reasons we talked about, but it also is important for sort of deterrence. And then finally, I think what you do is you probably communicate the sort of payoff over time of the capability, right? So I just don't have the capability because I think I need it, and I just don't have it to communicate it. It actually is making a consequential impact on our security. And so what that looks like is TV, radio, local newspaper, online sort of websites communicating that we thwarted so many, thefts of vehicles in our parking lot, or the intelligence we gathered from this small drone led to the apprehension of a criminal, whatever it is, right? So you would actually communicate very transparently the implications to build over time buy-in and to legitimize in the eyes of the public the capability providing sort of benefits that without it they would not achieve, right? And so again, because this is a lot, you want to acknowledge you have it. Two, you explain to your employees, the local community, when you're going to use it, why you're going to use it. And then three, you follow that up with sort of the implications publicly that are positive.
We've talked a lot about, again, the implications in communication. I think there's a ton of great advice here, Paul, that you've provided. I always like to end the podcast with a bit of a summary and just some general tips, if you will, for the security professionals, because, again, we've identified the problem. We've talked a lot about it. And I think, it's helpful for people to have a takeaway. And we've certainly seen that through the advice you provided. But if we had to sort of sum it up, we're dealing with post-pandemic chaos. We're dealing with increasing geopolitical tensions. Climate disasters are on the rise. I mean, there is so much for any security professional to worry about. And now we're talking about this new, at the moment, relatively unseen threat in Western countries. Of course, that could very well change. So why should the security professionals add drones to the list of threats, if you had to sum it all up?
Well, I think this is dependent upon the environment, again, that a security professional finds him or herself in. But generally speaking, these capabilities provide an asymmetry that's hard to defeat. They're cost effective while providing force protection for your own employees or your own military force. And so I think one is understanding that the asymmetry, the capability, secondly, is not bad all the time. And we should tap into public attitudes a little bit more going forward is probably some key takeaways.
Paul, I really appreciate your insight. This has been a fabulous discussion. I know you plugged your research and you've got a book as well. So certainly, if people want to get in touch with you, if they have questions about drones or if they want to find out more about how those vehicles can be used, what are some ways to either get in touch with you or to maybe do some more research or to get some really good, reliable sources on this emerging threat and concern and topic overall?
Yeah, and so probably the best way to do this, and happy to talk to anybody who's interested in talking more about this. I view it as sort of a moral obligation to kind of share experiences and have a conversation. I think probably the best way to do is to get online and go to either my website at Cornell, which has my education sort of Cornell email, or go to the Tech Policy Lab at Cornell University, Tech Policy Lab at Cornell University, and you can drop us a note there. A really interesting sort of institution that studies these issues empirically and be happy to entertain research projects or questions that people have.
Paul Lushenko is a U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and PhD student in International Relations at Cornell University in New York, joining us on SitRep. I'm Tristan Field-Jones. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at sitrep@samdesk.io or follow us on Twitter at samdeskofficial. Until next time, stay safe out there.